Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 5, The German Navy Law. The young disease that must subdue at length grows with growth and strengthens with strength. Quote by the Pope in the Essay on Man. I have shown how forward the Chancellor of the Exchequer was during the crisis of Agadir in every matter that could add to the strength of the British attitude. But as soon as the danger was past, he adopted a different demeanour. He felt that an effort should be made to heal any smart from which Germany might be suffering, and to arrive at a common understanding on naval strength. We knew that a formidable new navy law was in preparation and would shortly be declared. If Germany had definitely made up her mind to antagonize Great Britain, we must take up the challenge. But it might be possible, by friendly, sincere, and intimate conversations, to avert this perilous development. We were no enemies to German colonial expansion, and we would even have taken active steps to further her wishes in this respect. Surely something could be done to break the chain of blind causation. If aiding Germany in the colonial sphere was a means of procuring a stable situation, it was a price we were well prepared to pay. I was in full accord with this view. Apart from wider reasons, I felt I should be all the stronger in asking the Cabinet and the House of Commons for the necessary monies, if I could go hand in hand with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and testify that we had tried our best to secure a mitigation of the naval rivalry and failed. We therefore jointly consulted Sir Edward Grey, and then, with the Prime Minister's concurrence, we invited Sir Ernest Cassel to go to Berlin and get into direct touch with the Emperor. Sir Ernest was qualified for this task, as he knew the Emperor well and was at the same time devoted to British interests. We armed him with a brief but pregnant memorandum, which cannot be more tersely summarized than in von Bethmann-Hollweg's own words. Acceptance of English superiority at sea, no augmentation of the German naval program, a reduction as far as possible of that program, and on the part of England no impediment to our colonial expansion. Discussion and promotion of our colonial ambitions, proposals for mutual declarations that the two powers would not take part in aggressive plans or combinations against one another. Cassel accepted the charge and started at once. He remained only 2 days in Berlin and came at once to me on his return. He brought with him a cordial letter from the Emperor and a fairly full statement by von Bethmann-Hollweg of the new German navy law. We devoured this invaluable document all night long in the Admiralty, and in the morning I wrote as follows to Sir Edward Grey. January 31, 1912. Cassel returned last night, having travelled continuously from Berlin. At 10 a.m. on Monday he saw Balin, who went forthwith to the German Chancellor, and in the afternoon he saw Balin, Bethmann-Hollweg, and the Emperor together. They all seemed deeply pleased by the overture. Bethmann-Hollweg earnest and cordial, the Emperor enchanted, almost childishly so. The Emperor talked a great deal on naval matters to Cassel, the details of which he was unable to follow. After much consultation, the Emperor wrote out with Bethmann-Hollweg paper A, which Balin transcribed. The second paper, B, is Bethmann-Hollweg's statement of the impending naval increases, translated by Cassel. Cassel says they did not seem to know what they wanted in regard to colonies. They did not seem to be greatly concerned about expansion. There were 10 large companies in Berlin importing labor into Germany. Overpopulation was not their problem. They were delighted with Kassel's rough notes of our ideas. They are most anxious to hear from us soon. Such is my report. Observations. It seems certain that the Navy law will be presented to the Reichstag and that it will be agreed to, even the socialists not resisting. The naval increases are serious and will require new and vigorous measures on our part. The spirit may be good, but the facts are grim. I had been thinking that if the old German program had been adhered to, we should have built 4-3-4-3-4-3 against their 6 years program of 2-2-2-2-2-2. If their new program stands, as I fear it must, and they build 3-2-3-2-3-2, we cannot build less than 5-4-5-4-5-4. This maintains 60% superiority in dreadnoughts and dreadnought cruisers over Germany only. It will also be 2 keels to 1 on their additional 3 ships. The creation of a 3rd squadron in full commission is also a serious and formidable provision. At present, owing to the fact that in the 6 winter months the 1st and 2nd squadrons of the High Sea Fleet are congested with recruits, there is a great relief to us from the strain to which we are put by German naval power. The addition of the 3rd squadron will make that strain continual throughout the year. The maintenance in full commission of 25 battleships, which after the next 4 or 5 years will all be dreadnoughts, expose us to constant danger, only to be warded off by vigilance approximating to war conditions. A further assurance against attack is at present found in the fact that several of the German dreadnoughts are very often the wrong side of the Kiel Canal, which they cannot pass through and must therefore make a long detour. The deepening of the canal by 1913 will extinguish this safety signal. Footnote: it was not in fact completed till August 1914. The fact that the defender are always liable to be attacked, while only at their ordinary average strength, by an enemy at his selected moment and consequent maximum strength, means that our margins would have to be very large. Against 25 battleships we could not keep less than 40 available within 24 hours. This will involve additional expense. The German increase in personnel must also be met. I had intended to ask Parliament for 2,000 more men this year and 2,000 next. I expect to have to double these quotas. On the whole, the addition to our estimates consequent upon German increases will not be less than 3 millions a year. This is certainly not dropping the naval challenge. I agree with you that caution is necessary. In order to meet the new German squadron, we are contemplating bringing home the Mediterranean battleships. This means relying on France in the Mediterranean. Footnote: by later decisions, a squadron of British battlecruisers was stationed in the Mediterranean. End of footnote. And certainly no exchange of system, that is the intent, would be possible, even if desired by you. The only chance I see is roughly this. They will announce their new program, and we will make an immediate and effective reply. Then, if they care to slow down the tempo so that their fleet law is accomplished in 12 and not in 6 years, friendly relations would ensue, and we, though I should be reluctant to bargain about it, could slow down too. All they would have to do would be to make their quotas biennial instead of annual. Nothing would be deranged in their plan. 12 years of tranquility would be assured in naval policy. The attempt ought to be made. We laid these matters before the cabinet, who decided that a British cabinet minister should go to Berlin and selected Mr. Haldane for that purpose. The ex-emperor, in his memoirs, makes a ridiculous story out of this. A keen dispute had arisen among ministers, especially between Churchill and Grey, as to who should go to Berlin, in the event of the achievement of the object of making Germany abandon the further development of her fleet, and affix his name to this great historical document. Churchill considered himself the right man for the job, seeing that he was the head of the navy, but Grey and Asquith would not allow their colleague to reap the glory. Thus for a time Grey stood in the foreground, another proof that some political purpose rather than the number of ships was the leading factor. After a while, however, it was decided that it was more fitting to Grey's personal and official importance that he should appear only at the termination of the negotiations, to affix his name to the agreement, and to get his dinner from the emperor and to come in for his part of the festivities and fireworks, which, in good German, means to enjoy the Bengal light illumination. As it had been decided that in any event Churchill was not to get this, it was necessary to choose somebody for the negotiations who was in close accord with Asquith and Grey, and who, possessing their complete confidence, was willing to conduct the negotiations as far as the beginning of the fireworks. One, moreover, who was already known at Berlin and not a stranger to Germany. Churchill certainly qualified to this extent, for he had attended the imperial manoeuvres in Silesia and Württemberg on several occasions as a guest of the emperor. On this it may be observed that there never was any question of my going to Berlin to negotiate about the navy, nor did I at this time wish to go. All the British ministers concerned worked together in the utmost accord. After full discussions, we authorized Sir Ernest Cassel to send the following telegram. Sir E. Cassel to Herr Ballin, drafted by Sir E. Cassel, the First Lord, Mr. Haldane, and Sir Edward Grey. February 3rd, 1912. Spirit in which statement of German government have been made is most cordially appreciated here. New German program would entail serious and immediate increase of British naval expenditure, which was based on assumption that existing German naval program would be adhered to. If the British government are compelled to make such increase, it would make negotiations difficult, if not impossible. If, on the other hand, German naval expenditure can be adapted by an alteration of the tempo, or otherwise so as to render any serious increase unnecessary to meet German program, British government will be prepared to announce to pursue negotiations on the understanding that the point of naval expenditure is open to discussion and that there is a fair prospect of settling it favorably. If this understanding is acceptable, the British government will forthwith suggest the next step, as they think that the visit of a British minister to Berlin should in the first instance be private and unofficial. All being acceptable, the Secretary of State for War, accompanied by Sir Ernest Cassel, started accordingly on February 6 for Berlin. I had undertaken some weeks earlier to make a speech in support of the Home Rule Bill in Belfast. Violent hostility to this project developed in the inflammable capital of Ulster. Being publicly committed, I had no choice to fulfill my engagement, though, to avoid unnecessary provocation, the meeting place was changed from the Ulster Hall to a large tent which was erected in the outskirts of the city. Threats of violence and riot were loudly proclaimed on every side, and nearly 10,000 troops were concentrated in the area to keep the peace. I had planned, if all went well at Belfast, to go on the next day to Glasgow to inspect some of the shipbuilding works along the Clyde, and to make a speech on the naval position, which should state very plainly our rude intentions and be the necessary counterpart of the Haldane mission. As I was waiting for the train for Ireland to leave the London railway station, I read in the late edition of the evening papers the German Emperor's speech on the opening of the Reichstag, announcing bills for the increase both of the army and the navy. The new navy law was still a secret to the British and German nation alike, but knowing as I did its scope and character, and viewing it in conjunction with the Army Bill, I sustained a strong impression at this moment of the approaching danger. One sentence, full of German self-revelation, stood out vividly. It is my constant duty and care to maintain and to strengthen, on land and water, the power of defense of the German people, which has no lack of young men fit to bear arms. It was indeed true. One thought of France with her declining birth rate peering out across her fortress into the wide German lands and silently reflecting on these young men fit to bear arms, of whom there was indeed no lack. My mind, skipping over the day of Irish turmoil and the worry of the speech that lay before me, fixed upon Glasgow as the place where some answer to this threat of continental domination might perhaps be provided. Once again Europe might find a safeguard against military overlordship in an island which had never been and never would be lacking in trained and hardy mariners bred from their boyhood up to the service of the sea. Accordingly, after the Irish ordeal was over, I said at Glasgow, "The purposes of British naval power are essentially defensive. We have no thoughts, and we have never had any thoughts of aggression, and we attribute no such thoughts to other great powers. There is, however, this difference between the British naval power and the naval power of the great and friendly empire, and I trust it may long remain the great and friendly empire of Germany. The British Navy is to us a necessity, and, from some points of view, the German Navy is to them more in the nature of a luxury. Our naval power involves British existence. It is existence to us, it is expansion to them. We cannot menace the peace of a single continental hamlet, no matter how great and supreme our navy may become. But on the other hand, the whole fortunes of our race and empire, the whole treasure accumulated during so many centuries of sacrifice and achievement, would perish and be swept utterly away if our naval supremacy were to be impaired. It is the British Navy which makes Great Britain a great power. But Germany was a great power, respected and honored all over the world, before she had a single ship. If today our position is eminently satisfactory, we owe much to the foresight and resolution of Mr. McKenna. Whatever is needed for the safety of the country will be asked for by the government, and granted by the representatives of the nation with universal assent. There is no need for anxiety in regard to our shipbuilding capacity. There is no chance whatever of our being overtaken in naval strength unless we want to be. But what of the men? We have today 135,000 men in the active service ratings of the Navy. The great bulk of them are long-service men who have begun as boys and have been trained as a lifelong profession to the naval service. We have no difficulty in recruiting for the Navy, and there is no doubt whatever of our ability to make any increases which may be necessary, and which I think will be necessary in the personnel of the Navy. We have great reserves of seamen in this country. There are measures which may be taken to make a greater use of our reserves than has hitherto been found possible, and I have given directions for that part of the subject to be carefully studied by the naval experts upon whom I rely. Our reserves, both from the Royal Navy and from the mercantile marine, are a great resource, and this island has never been, and never will be, lacking in trained and hardy mariners bred from their boyhood up to the service of the sea. Whatever may happen abroad, there will be no whining here. No signals of distress will be hoisted. No cries for help or succor will go up. We will face the future as our ancestors would have faced it, without disquiet, without arrogance, but in stolid and inflexible determination. We should be the first power to welcome any retardation or slackening of naval rivalry. We should meet any such slackening, not by words, but by deeds. If there are to be increases upon the continent of Europe, we shall have no difficulty in meeting them to the satisfaction of the country. As naval competition becomes more acute, we shall have not only to increase the number of the ships we build, but the ratio which our naval strength will have to bear to other great naval powers, so that our margin of superiority will become larger and not smaller as the strain grows greater. Thus we shall make it clear that other naval powers, instead of overtaking us by additional efforts, will only be more outdistanced in consequence of the measures which we ourselves shall take. This speech created a considerable outcry in Germany, which was immediately re-echoed by a very large proportion of our own liberal press. It appeared that the word luxury had a bad significance when translated into German. The Luxusflotte became an expression passed angrily from lip to lip in Germany. As I expected, on the return to London, I found my colleagues offended. Their congratulations upon Belfast were silenced by their reproaches about Glasgow. Mr. Haldane returned 2 days later from Berlin, and the cabinet was summoned to receive an account of his mission. Contrary to general expectation, however, the Secretary of State for War declared that so far from being a hindrance to him in his negotiations, the Glasgow speech had been the greatest possible help. He had in fact used almost identical arguments to von Bethmann-Hollweg the day before. He had told the Chancellor that if Germany added a third squadron, we should have to maintain 5 or even 6 squadrons in home waters, perhaps bringing ships from the Mediterranean to strengthen them. That if ships were added to the existing program, we should proceed at once to lay down 2 keels to each of the new German additions, and that for the sake of the Navy, people would not complain of the addition of another shilling to the income tax. He described how he had read the operative passages in my speech himself to the Emperor and von Tirpitz in proof and confirmation of what he had himself been saying during their previous discussions. This settled the matter so far as I was concerned. It was only another instance of the very manly and loyal part which Mr. Haldane took at all times and on every question connected with the preparedness of this country for war with Germany. Mr. Haldane brought back with him the actual text of the new German Navy laws, or Novelle as it was called. This had been handed to him by the Emperor during the course of the discussion. It was an elaborate technical document. Mr. Haldane had had the prudence to refuse to express any opinion upon it till it had been examined by the Admiralty experts. We now subjected this document to a rigorous scrutiny. The result more than confirmed my first unfavorable impression. The main feature in the new law, I reported to the Cabinet on February 14, is the extraordinary increase in the striking force of ships of all classes immediately available throughout the year. Whereas formerly we reckoned against 17 battleships, 4 battle cruisers and 12 small cruisers in the active battle fleet, demobilized to a great extent during the winter months, we must in future prepare against 25, 12, and 18, which are not to be subject to anything like the same degree of temporary demobilization. Full permanent crews are to be provided for all, or nearly all, torpedo boat destroyers, now aggregating 115, and working up to an authorized total of 144, instead of for half the number as at present. There is to be an increase on the already large provision of £750,000 in this year's estimates for submarines. The numbers are not stated, but from the fact that 121 additional executive officers are required for this service alone by 1920. We may infer that between 50 and 60 submarines are to be added. Footnote: the final published text of the law provided for 72. We know nothing of the rate at which this construction is to be achieved. The increase in personnel are also important. Under their existing law, the Germans are working to a total of 86,500 in 1917, by annual increments of 3,500. The new law adds 15,000 officers and men and raises the total in 1920 to 101,500. On March 9, I pointed out that the fundamental proposition of the negotiations from the Admiralty point of view had been that the existing German Navy law should not be increased, but, if possible, reduced, whereas, on the contrary, a new law was certainly to be enacted providing for large and progressive increases, not only in 1912, but in the 5 following years. Practically 4/5 of the German Navy were to be placed permanently upon a war footing. The German government would be able to have available at all seasons of the year 25 or perhaps 29 fully commissioned battleships, whereas at the present time the British government have in full commission in home waters only 22, even counting the Atlantic Fleet. Thus, on the fundamental proposition, we encountered an unyielding attitude. Nevertheless, we persevered, and the discussion was transferred to the question of a mutual declaration against aggressive plans. Here Sir Edward Grey offered the following formula: England will make no unprovoked attack upon Germany, and pursue no aggressive policy towards her. Aggression upon Germany is not the subject, and forms no part of any treaty, understanding, or combination to which England is now a party, nor will she become a party to anything that has such an object. The German government considered this formula inadequate and suggested through their ambassador the following additional clause: England will therefore observe at least a benevolent neutrality should war be forced upon Germany, or England will therefore, as a matter of course, remain neutral if a war is forced upon Germany. This last condition would have carried us far beyond our original intention, and might well have been held to deprive us of the power to come to the aid of France in a war forced, or alleged to be forced, upon Germany as a result of a quarrel between Austria and Russia. It would certainly have been regarded as terminating the intent. Moreover, even if we had taken this step, the new German Navy law was not to be withdrawn. At the most, it was to be modified. Thus a complete deadlock was reached at an early stage. Still, So important did we think it to create at least a friendly spirit, and so desirous were we of placating Germany and gratifying her aspirations, that we still persisted in an endeavor to come to an arrangement beneficial to Germany in the colonial sphere. These negotiations were still progressing and had almost reached a conclusion definitely advantageous to Germany when the war broke out. Lord Fisher did not like the idea of a naval program. On February 13, 1912, he wrote, "I can't support you at all in any way whatever for any 2 years or more program. Some DD fool has got hold of you to have made you say that. The great secret is to put off to the very last hour the ship, big or little, that you mean to build, or perhaps not to build her at all. You see all your rivals' plans fully developed. Their vessels started beyond recall, and then in each individual answer to each such rival vessel you plunge with a design 50% better. Knowing that your rapid shipbuilding and command of money will enable you to have your vessel fit to fight as soon, if not sooner, than the rival vessel. Sometimes, as in one famous year, you can drop an armored ship and put the money into acceleration of those building because you have a new design coming along. So don't be a DDS and deliberately lay down a ship which you know is obsolete by some sudden vast step in old Watt's brain. Sufficient for the year is the program thereof. For God's sake, get that written up somewhere for you to look at when you get out of bed in the morning. And do please tell me the name of the born fool who hoaxed you. Is it— He has just got a gold medal in America for advocating smaller battleships, I believe. You know, Archbishop Whately proved that Napoleon Bonaparte never existed. We are asses now for not building a 16-inch gun, as Sir E. Wilmot told you in the letter I sent you, but you can't help yourself any more than you can help deliberately laying down ships for the line of battle that go less than 30 knots. There are certain things, my beloved Winston, that even God Almighty can't help, let alone you. He, for instance, can't help 2 added to 2 being 4. The most damnable thing in the world is a servile copyist. One of the 4 Nelsonic attributes is power of initiative, and plunge is the watchword of progress. But I sicken you with my reiteration, so goodbye. I replied on February 19. I am delighted to see your handwriting again. I had begun to fear the well of truth and inspiration was running dry. Do not, however, shut your mind against a program. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and I have been agreed on this policy ever since 1909, and I am quite certain that it can be developed so as to secure the greatest advantages without any sacrifice of elasticity. Such a program as I have in mind will cover the whole period of the existing German Navy law. It will deal only with the numbers of capital ships. It will be framed on certain clearly defined assumptions. It will be capable both of expansion and of diminution, of retardation and acceleration. It will not necessarily be embodied in an Act of Parliament. It will probably have to be revised after 4 years. It will recite certain definite facts of the existing shipbuilding situation, particularly in relation to Germany and Austria. It will be measured in relation to these facts so as to secure ample margins of superiority both in new construction and in establishment over those powers. Unforeseen contingencies will be met by additions, but it would always be open within certain limits for England and Germany to agree upon proportionate reductions. The program of minor construction will be entirely flexible and expressed only in terms of money. At present we suffer every disadvantage, a panic and a row every year, spasmodic building, hopeless finance, total lack of foresight in regard to the labor market, and no means of bargaining with our competitors. At present we have nothing to put against their threats. Nothing, in my opinion, would more surely dishearten Germany than the certain proof that, as the result of all her present and prospective efforts, she will only be more hopelessly behindhand in 1920. She would know it was not a bluff, because if a Liberal government would propose it, a Tory government would a fortiori carry it farther. The vast financial reserves of which John Bull can dispose would come into view, and would weigh in the balance with a direct and real weight. It is the uncertainty as to whether we shall throw up the sponge or not, on which the German Navy has lived and fattened. The standard will be 60% preponderance in new construction against the present law, and 2 keels to 1 for all increases above it. 60% preponderance in men, 20 to 12 destroyers, at least 2 to 1 in armored cruisers, protected cruisers and their equivalents, submarines and small fry generally. This is no new idea of mine. I have been working it out ever since I came to the Admiralty, and I am absolutely convinced that it is the only way of securing economy, efficiency, and moral effect. Whether the plan, when made, should be published is a political question. How Navy estimates should be financed is for the Treasury and the House of Commons to decide. What the Admiralty are concerned with is the maintenance of proper margins and superiority, the power to look ahead, and the power within certain prescribed limits to maneuver. Hopwood and Sir Marcus Samuel are hard at it over oil. Footnote: Sir Francis Hopwood, now Lord Southborough, the additional civil lord. End of footnote. This letter mollified the Admiral. On the 25th of February 1912 he wrote, "I hasten to reply to your letter on February 19, just arrived. Because, if your program, which has my enthusiastic admiration, is not embodied in an Act of Parliament, then all my objections vanish. An Act of Parliament, the Naval Defence Act, made us build 20 cruisers that had only 48 hours coal supply. Can I ever forget that? But Providence came along and made them useful as mine layers. However, ocean trams at £10 a ton would have been cheaper and more effective. Sir W. White built the County class and forgot the guns. But Providence came along and has made them useful for commerce protectors with their 6-inch guns and big coal supply and good speed. However, a few Mauretanias would be far more effective than 100 counties. Footnote: a doubtful gem. They could have coaled only in a few ports with special appliances. End of footnote. I can only pray that your program will be officially published, for it is sure to leak out. It will add immensely to our reputation and influence, and the moral effect will be prodigious. The keynote is 2 keels to 1 for all increases above the present German law. 2 to 1 in armored cruisers is also vital. You don't say a word of your visit to Jellicoe, but he does. He is much impressed with your grasp of the whole business, and as Jellicoe very seldom indeed gives praise, I think you must have talked well. As well as that night we stumbled over the dockyard stores at Devonport returning from the Lion and the Monarch. It's a pity we didn't have a shorthand writer. Don't make any mistake about big submarines being obligatory. Big risks bring big success. It was Napoleon, wasn't it? Risk nothing, get nothing. Increased surface speed is above all a necessity, and broadside torpedo discharges and the bigger gun will come automatically with the above two essentials, and they, the big submarines, will be destroyers with all the advantages of the present destroyers and, as well, the power of submergence during daylight attacks. Battle tactics will be revolutionized, and England's power will be multiplied, not sevenfold, but manyfold, and with a radius of action of 6,000 miles, but it wants an Isaiah to proclaim this vision. For God's sake, trample on and stamp out protected cruisers and hurry up aviation. For a specimen of Fisher's genius, I commend these last few lines. 10 years of submarine development, spurred on by war on the greatest scale, were required to overtake in exact sequence the processes of that amazing vision in technical affairs. The consequences to Great Britain were, however, not so satisfactory as he forecasted. Early in March, while the new German Navy law was still unannounced, it was necessary to present our estimates to the House of Commons. It would of course have been a breach of faith with the German Emperor to let any suggestion pass my lips that we already knew what the text of the Navy law was. I was therefore obliged to make my first speech on naval matters on a purely hypothetical basis. This is what we are going to do if no further increases are made in the German fleet. Should unhappily the rumors which we hear prove true, I shall have to present a supplementary estimate to the House, etc. In this speech I laid down clearly what the assent of the Cabinet, the principles which should govern our naval construction in the next 5 years, and the standards of strength we should follow in capital ships. This standard was as follows: 60% in dreadnoughts over Germany as long as she adhered to her present declared program, and 2 keels to 1 for every additional ship laid down by her. 2 complications of these clear principles were unavoidable. First, the 2 Lord Nelsons, although not dreadnoughts, were stronger in many ways, particularly in armor and subdivision, than the original dreadnought herself. Although projected earlier, they had actually been completed later. Acting on the advice of the naval staff, I counted these throughout as dreadnoughts. On the other hand, any ships provided by the Dominions were to be additional to anything we might build ourselves. Otherwise, the efforts of the Dominions would not have resulted in any accession to our naval strength, and consequently these efforts might have been discouraged. Proceeding on these lines, I set out the 6 years of British construction at 4-3, 4-3, 4-3, against a uniform German construction of 2. These numbers were well received by the House of Commons. We were not sure whether the Germans would adhere to an offer made to Mr. Haldane to drop one of the 3 extra ships embodied in their new Navy law. This, however, proved ultimately to be the case and was at any rate a tangible result of the Haldane mission. In Tirpitz's words, he, Haldane, next came out with a proposal of a certain delay in the building of the 3 ships. Could we not distribute them over 12 years? He only wanted a token of our readiness to meet England, more for the sake of form. Haldane himself proposed that we should retard the rate of our increase, in order to lubricate the negotiations, or that we should at least cancel the first of the 3 ships. He outlined in writing of his own accord the same principle which I had previously fixed upon in my own mind as a possible concession. I therefore sacrificed the ship. We therefore sacrificed 2 hypothetical ships and our programs, which would have been increased to 545454, were ultimately declared at 454444. The splendid gift of the Malaya, the Federated Malay States raised the figure of the first year from 4 to 5. In announcing these decisions to Parliament later in the same month, I made publicly and definitely those proposals for a naval holiday which were fruitless so far as Britain and Germany were concerned, but the principle of which has since been adopted by the English-speaking peoples of the world. Take as an instance of this proposition I am putting forward for general consideration the year 1913. In that year, as I apprehend, Germany will build 3 capital ships, and it will be necessary for us to build 5 in consequence. Supposing we were both to take a holiday for that year and introduce a blank page into the book of misunderstanding. Supposing that Germany were to build no ships that year, she would save herself between 6 and 7 millions sterling. But that is not all. In ordinary circumstances, we should not begin our ships until Germany had started hers. The 3 ships that she did not build would therefore automatically wipe out no fewer than 5 British potential super-dreadnoughts. That is more than I expect they could hope to do in a brilliant naval action. As to the indirect results within a single year, they simply cannot be measured, not only between our 2 great brother nations, but to all the world. They are results immeasurable in their hope and brightness. This, then, is the position which we take up, that the Germans will be no gainers over us so far as naval power is concerned by any increases they may make, and no losers on the basis I have laid down by any diminution. By the beginning of April it became certain that no general arrangement for a naval holiday could be effected with Germany. The Emperor sent me a courteous message through Sir Ernest Cassel, expressing his great regret, but adding that such arrangements would only be possible between allies. Herr Ballin wrote at the same time to Sir Ernest. I entirely share your opinion of Churchill's speech, and believe that it is simply the unusual feature of frankness and honesty which flustered the whole world, and especially the leading parties here, and has caused a torrent of indignation in the press. It is not easy to become all at once accustomed to such a complete change from the mystery-mongering hitherto prevalent. Up to now, it was thought that language was given to British and German Navy ministers to conceal their thoughts. Suddenly someone makes a new departure, and everybody asks disconcertedly, what does this man want? A few friendly lines addressed to you about the report I sent would have a happy effect. A complaint which we were reputed to have made about an alleged clandestine visit of certain German ships to the Shetland Islands. If he wishes it, Churchill can make use of this opportunity in a few quite unofficial lines addressed to you, to brush away the shadows which were created in high quarters here by the luxury fleet, Luxusflotte, and the absence of warmth in his last speech. This will be a great help in the political negotiations. It would be too pitiful if, owing to misunderstanding and sentiment, the great work of arrangement were to be hindered. In compliance, I therefore wrote the following letter for the Emperor's eye. Mr. Churchill to Sir Ernest Cassel, April 14, 1912. I am deeply impressed by the Emperor's great consideration. I only mentioned the incident to Ballin as an example to show the kind of anxiety and the strain to which the naval situation gives rise. I am very glad to know that it was free from all sinister significance, and I take this opportunity of saying again that we have been throughout equally innocent of any offensive design. I suppose it is difficult for either country to realize how formidable it appears to the eyes of the other. Certainly it must be almost impossible for Germany, with her splendid armies and warlike population, capable of holding their native soil against all corners, and situated inland with road and railway communications on every side, to appreciate the sentiments with which an island state like Britain views the steady and remorseless development of a rival naval power of the very highest efficiency. The more we admire the wonderful work that has been done in the swift creation of German naval strength, the stronger, the deeper, and the more preoccupying those sentiments become. Patience, however, and good temper accomplish much, and as the years pass, many difficulties and dangers seem to settle themselves peacefully. Meanwhile, there is an anxious defile to be traversed, and what will help more, perhaps, than anything else to make the journey safe for us all, is the sincere desire for goodwill and confidence of which Ballin's letter and its enclosure are a powerful testimony. The growth of the German navy produced its inevitable consequences. The British fleet, for safety's sake, had to be concentrated in home waters. The first concentration had been made by Lord Fisher in 1904. This had effected the reduction of very large numbers of small old vessels, which were scattered about the world, showing the flag and the formation in their place of stronger, better, more homogeneous squadrons at home. This measure was also a great and wise economy of money. A few months later, the British battleships were recalled from China. The more distant oceans had thus been abandoned. But now a further measure of concentration was required. We saw ourselves compelled to withdraw the battleships from the Mediterranean. Only by this measure could the trained men be obtained to form the 3rd Battle Squadron in full commission in home waters. It was decided by the Cabinet that we must still maintain a powerful force in the Mediterranean, and ultimately 4 battle cruisers and an armoured cruiser squadron were accordingly based on Malta. It was further decided that a dreadnought battle squadron should also be developed in the Mediterranean by the year 1916, equal in strength to that of the growing Austrian battle fleet. These decisions were taken with the deliberate object of regaining our complete independence. But the withdrawal, even if only for a few years, of the battleships from the Mediterranean was a noteworthy event. It made us appear to be dependent upon the French fleet in those waters. The French also at the same time redisposed their forces. Under the growing pressure of German armaments, Britain transferred her whole battle fleet to the North Sea, and France moved all her heavy ships into the Mediterranean, and the sense of mutual reliance grew swiftly between both navies. It is astonishing that Admiral von Tirpitz should never have comprehended what the consequences of his policy must be. Even after the war, he could write, "In order to estimate the strength of the trump card which our fleet put in the hands of an energetic diplomacy at this time, one must remember that in consequence of the concentration of the English forces which we had caused in the North Sea, the English control of the Mediterranean and Far Eastern waters had practically ceased. The only trump card which Germany secured by this policy was the driving of Britain and France closer and closer together. From the moment that the fleets of France and Britain were disposed in this new way, our common naval interests became very important, and the moral claims which France could make upon Great Britain if attacked by Germany, whatever we had stipulated to the contrary, were enormously extended. Indeed, my anxiety was aroused to try to prevent this necessary recall of our ships from tying us up too tightly with France and depriving us of that liberty of choice on which our power to stop a war might well depend. When in August 1912 the Cabinet decided that naval conversations should take place between the French and British admiralties, similar to those which had been held since 1906 between the general staffs, I set forth this point as clearly as possible in a minute which I addressed to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and we did our utmost to safeguard ourselves. To Sir Edward Grey, Prime Minister, August 23, 1912. The point I am anxious to safeguard is our freedom of choice if the occasion arises, and the consequent power to influence French policy beforehand. That freedom will be sensibly impaired if the French can say that they have denuded their Atlantic seaboard, and concentrated in the Mediterranean on the faith of naval arrangements made with us. This will not be true. If we did not exist, the French could not make better dispositions than at present. They are not strong enough to face Germany alone, still less to maintain themselves in two theatres. They therefore rightly concentrate their navy in the Mediterranean, where it can be safe and superior, and can assure their African communications. Neither is it true that we are relying on France to maintain our position in the Mediterranean. If France did not exist, we should make no other disposition of our forces. Circumstances might arise which, in my judgment, would make it desirable and right for us to come to the aid of France with all our force by land and sea. But we ask nothing in return. If we were attacked by Germany, we should not make it a charge of bad faith against the French that they left us to fight it out alone, and nothing in naval and military arrangements ought to have the effect of exposing us to such a charge if, when the time comes, we decide to stand out. This is my view, and I am sure I am in line with you on the principle. I am not at all particular how it is to be given effect to, and I make no point about what document it is set forth in. But consider how tremendous would be the weapon which France would possess to compel our intervention, if she could say, "On the advice of and by arrangement with your naval authorities, we have left our northern coasts defenseless. We cannot possibly come back in time." Indeed, I added somewhat inconsequently, it would probably be decisive whatever is written down now. Everyone must feel who knows the fact that we have the obligations of an alliance without its advantages, and above all without its precise definitions. Winston as Churchill. The difficulty proved a real one. The technical naval discussions could only be conducted on the basis that the French fleet should be concentrated in the Mediterranean, and that in case of a war in which both countries took part, it would fall to the British fleet to defend the northern and western coasts of France. The French, as I had foreseen, naturally raised the point that if Great Britain did not take part in the war, their northern and western coasts would be completely exposed. We, however, while recognizing the difficulty, steadfastly declined to allow the naval arrangements to bind us in any political sense. It was eventually agreed that if there was a menace of war, the two governments should consult together and concert beforehand what common action, if any, they should take. The French were obliged to accept this position and to affirm definitely that the naval conversations did not involve any obligation of common action. This was the best we could do for ourselves and for them. When the time came, there was no doubt as to what England wished to do. I commend these discussions and the document I have printed above to German eyes. The German naval minister exults in a policy which has had the effect of uniting in common defense against Germany, in spite of themselves, two powerful fleets till then rivals. The British ministers, so far from welcoming this consolidation of forces in the opposite balance to Germany, are anxious to preserve their freedom of action and reluctant to become entangled with continental powers. Germany was, in fact, forging a coalition against herself, and Britain was seeking to save her from the consequences of her unwisdom. It is not often that one can show so plainly the workings of events, but all was lost on Admiral von Tirpitz. This sincere, wrong-headed, purblind old Prussian firmly believed that the growth of his beloved navy was inducing in British minds an increasing fear of war, whereas it simply produced naval rejoinders and diplomatic reactions which strengthened the forces and closed the ranks of the Entente. It is almost pathetic to read the foolish sentences in which, on page after page of his memoirs, he describes how much Anglo-German relations were improved in 1912, 1913, and 1914 through the realization by the British people of Germany's great and growing naval power. He notices that the violent agitations against German naval expansion, which swept England in 1904 and again in 1908, were succeeded by a comparatively calm period in which both powers were building peacefully and politely against each other. This, he thinks, was a proof that his treatment was succeeding, and that all friction was passing away. Another dose or two, and it would be gone altogether. The violent agitations in England were, however, the symptom of doubt and difference of opinion in our national life about whether the German menace was real or not, and whether the right measures were being taken to meet it. As doubts and differences on these points were gradually replaced by general agreement among the leading men in all parties to meet a grave danger, the agitations subsided. The excitement in the press and in Parliament, the warning speeches and counter-speeches were not intended for foreign consumption. England was not trying to make an impression upon Germany. She was trying to make up her own mind, and in proportion as this mind arrived at solid and final conclusions, silence was again restored. But it was not the silence of sleep. With every rivet that von Tirpitz drove into his ships of war, he united British opinion throughout wide circles of the most powerful people in every walk of life and in every part of the empire. The hammers that clanged at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven were forging the coalition of nations by which Germany was to be resisted and finally overthrown. Every threatening gesture that she made, every attempt to shock or shake the loosely knit structure of the Entente, made it close and fit together more tightly. Thus Tirpitz. British statesmen naturally did not stress the fact in their conversations with Germans that it was mainly the presence of our nearly completed fleet in the North Sea that had produced their respectful tone, and had lessened the probability of a British attack. Of course, they only spoke of their peaceful inclinations, and not so much of the facts which strengthened these inclinations. And again in his Memoirs, Volume 1, page 192, 17 years of fleet-building had, it is true, improved the prospects of an acceptable peace with England. Is it possible to be further from the truth than this? There never had been any probability or possibility of a British attack on Germany. Why should we attack Germany for building ships when we could ourselves build more ships quicker and cheaper? Why incur the guilt, cost, and hazard of war when a complete remedy was obvious and easy? But the respectful tone was that of men who felt how serious the position had become, and were anxious to avoid any responsibility for causing a crisis. It was not restraint imposed by fear of the nearly completed fleet in the North Sea, but the calm resulting from the resolve to be prepared. The organization of a fleet differs throughout from that of an army. Armies only keep a small proportion of their soldiers in regular service. These form the framework of the battalions, train the recruits, and keep guard in times of peace. When the order is given to mobilize, all the men who have been already trained but are living at home in civil life are called up as they are wanted. And then, and not till then, the army is ready to fight. Navies, on the other hand, were in the main always ready. The British Navy had all its best ships fully and permanently manned with whole-time men, called active service ratings. Measured by quality, nearly the whole of its power was therefore constantly available. Measured even by numbers, nearly 3/4 of the ships could go into action without calling out the reserves. Only the oldest and most obsolete ships were manned in time of war by the Naval Reserve, that is, men who had left the Navy and had returned to civil life. These obsolete vessels were the only part of the fleet which had to be mobilized like the armies of Europe. Thus, mobilization, which is the foundation of all great armies, plays only a very small part in fleets. Every ship that really counted was always ready to steam and fight as soon as an order reached her. The organization of the British home fleets, when I came to the Admiralty, seemed to a mind accustomed to military symmetry, to leave much to be desired. The terminology was misleading and confused. The word division was used in 3 different senses, sometimes tactical and sometimes administrative. The battle units were uneven in numbers. The degree of readiness and efficiency of the different squadrons was not apparent from the classes in which they were grouped. In consultation with Sir Francis Bridgeman, Prince Louis, and Rear Admiral Troubridge, the first chief of the new war staff, I designed a new and symmetrical organization for the fleets. All the ships available for home defense were divided into the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd fleets, comprising 8 battle squadrons of 8 battleships each, together with their attendant cruiser squadrons, flotillas, and auxiliaries. The 1st fleet comprised a fleet flagship and 4 battle squadrons of ships in full commission, manned entirely with active service ratings, and therefore always ready. To form this fleet, it was necessary to base the former Atlantic Fleet in home ports instead of on Gibraltar, and to base the battleships hitherto in the Mediterranean on Gibraltar instead of Malta. By this concentration, an additional battle squadron of strong ships, the King Edward's, was always ready in home waters. The 2nd fleet consisted of 2 battle squadrons, also fully manned with active service ratings, but having about 40% of these learning and requalifying in the gunnery, torpedo, and other schools. This fleet was termed in active commission because it could fight at any moment, but to realize its highest efficiency it required to touch at its home ports and march on board its balance crews from the schools. In all these 6 battle squadrons, containing with the cruiser squadrons every modern and middle-aged ship in the Navy, there was not to be found a single reservist. No mobilization was therefore necessary to bring the whole of this force into action. The 3rd fleet also consisted of 2 battle squadrons and 5 cruiser squadrons of our oldest ships. These were only manned by care and maintenance parties and required the reserves to be called out before they could put to sea. In order to accelerate the mobilization of the leading battle squadrons and certain cruisers of the Third Fleet, a special class of the reserve was now formed called the Immediate Reserve, who received higher pay and periodical training, and were liable to be called up in advance of general mobilization. Germany was adding a third squadron to the High Sea Fleet, thus increasing her always-ready strength from 17 to 25. We, in reply, by the measures set out above and various others too technical for description here, raised our always-ready fleet from 33 battleships to 49, and other forces in like proportion. On mobilization, the German figures would rise to 38, and the British at first to 57, and ultimately, as the new organization was completed, to 65. The reader will not be able to understand the issues involved in the completion and mobilization of the fleets on the eve of the war unless this organization, as explained above, is mastered. We made a great assembly of the Navy this spring of 1912 at Portland. The flags of a dozen admirals, the broad pennants of as many commodores, and the pennants of 150 ships were flying together. The king came in the royal yacht, the Admiralty flag at the fore, the standard at the main, and the jack at the mizzen, and bided among his sailors for 4 days. One day there is a long cruise out into mist, dense, utterly baffling, the whole fleet steaming together, all invisible, keeping station by weird siren screamings and hootings. It seemed incredible that no harm would befall. And then suddenly the fog lifted, and the distant targets could be distinguished, and the whole long line of battleships, coming one after another into view, burst into tremendous flares of flame and hurled their shells with deafening detonations, while the water rose in tall fountains. The fleet returns, 3 battle squadrons abreast, cruisers and flotillas disposed ahead and astern. The speed is raised to 20 knots. Streaks of white foam appear at the bows of every vessel. The land draws near. The broad bay already embraces this swiftly moving gigantic armada. The ships in their formation already fill the bay. The foreign officers I have with me on the Enchantress bridge stare anxiously. We still steam fast. 5 minutes more, and the van of the fleet will be aground. 4 minutes, 3 minutes. There, at last, the signal. A string of bright flags is hauled down from the Neptune's halyards. Every anchor falls together. Their cables roar through the hawser holes. Every propeller whirls astern. In 150 yards, it seems every ship is stationary. Look along the lines, miles this way and miles that. They might have been drawn with a ruler. The foreign observers gasped. These were great days. From dawn to midnight, day after day, one's whole mind was absorbed by the fascination and novelty of the problems which came crowding forward. And all the time there was a sense of power to act, to form, to organize. All the ablest officers in the Navy standing ready, loyal and eager, with argument, guidance, information. Everyone feeling a sense that a great danger had passed very near us, that there was a breathing space before it would return, that we must be better prepared next time. Saturdays, Sundays, and any other spare day I spent always with the fleet at Portsmouth or at Portland or Devonport, or with the flotillas at Harwich. Officers of every rank came on board to lunch or dine, and discussion proceeded without ceasing on every aspect of naval war and administration. The Admiralty yacht Enchantress was now to become largely my office, almost my home, and my work my sole occupation and amusement. In all, I spent 8 months afloat in the 3 years before the war. I visited every dockyard, shipyard, and naval establishment in the British Isles and in the Mediterranean, and every important ship. I examined for myself every point of strategic consequence and every piece of Admiralty property. I got to know what everything looked like and where everything was, and how one thing fitted into another. In the end, I could put my hand on anything that was wanted and knew thoroughly the current state of our naval affairs. I recall vividly my first voyage from Portsmouth to Portland, where the fleet lay. A grey afternoon was drawing to a close. As I saw the fleet for the first time drawing out of the haze, a friend reminded me of that far-off line of storm-beaten ships on which the eyes of the Grand Army had never looked, but which had in their day stood between Napoleon and the dominion of the world. In Portland Harbour the yacht lay surrounded by the great ships. The whole harbour was alive with the goings and comings of launches and small craft of every kind, and as night fell, 10,000 lights from sea and shore sprang into being, and every masthead twinkled as the ships and squadrons conversed with one another. Who could fail to work for such a service? Who could fail when the very darkness seemed loaded with the menace of approaching war? For consider these ships, so vast in themselves, yet so small, so easily lost to sight on the surface of the waters. Sufficient at the moment, we trusted, for their task, but yet only a score or so. They were all we had. On them, as we conceived, floated the might, majesty, dominion, and power of the British Empire. All our long history built up century after century, all great affairs in every part of the globe, all the means of livelihood and safety of our faithful, industrious, active population depended upon them. Open the sea-cocks and let them sink beneath the surface, as another fleet was one day to do in another British harbour far to the north, and in a few minutes, half an hour at the most, the whole outlook of the world would be changed. The British Empire would dissolve like a dream, each isolated community struggling forward by itself, the central power of union broken, mighty provinces, whole empires in themselves, drifting hopelessly out of control and falling a prey to strangers, and Europe, after one sudden convulsion, passing into the iron grip and rule of the Teuton, and of all that the Teutonic system meant. There would only be left, far off across the Atlantic, unarmed, unready, and as yet uninstructed America, to maintain, single-handed, law and freedom among men. Guard them well, admirals and captains, hardy tars and tall marines. Guard them well and guide them true.